Hi folks, thanks so much for checking out the webinar. Before you jump into the content, I just wanted to provide a little context around how everyone has very different reactions to grief. You'll notice that part of my general way of speaking is a relatively high level of gaiety. I giggle and I laugh a lot, even when I'm not talking about challenging topics like grief. And you'll definitely hear me doing that as I'm discussing grief in this context. I think it's important to mention that because I know that for some folks, grief is no laughing matter. But I think it's also important to understand that everyone has very different reactions to grief. And for me, humor is definitely my most readily present reaction. And so, you'll hear that certainly in my voice. Humor is something that helps us deal with challenging situations and with tension. Laughter is a great pressure valve release in that way. But I just wanted to speak to that before you jump into listening to this content, given that for some folks, laughter seems like a really strange thing to be present in a conversation around grief. So with that being said, I hope you enjoy what's been covered in the webinar, and thanks so much for checking it out. And I hope that you're able to access some information or some input in this webinar that maybe will help you in your own journey with grief.
So feelings, we've all got them. They're all inside of us. Sometimes they come out. We can't always predict how they're going to come out. And so I'm always really inspired by, if you don't mind going to the next slide, Christine, to figure out how we're going to communicate about this. Maybe I'll wink at you and it's time to go to the next slide. Anyway, I really love this quote from Mr. Rogers, who has in my own life been a real inspiration and instructor when it comes to managing and dealing with feelings. And what Mr. Rogers says is anything mentionable is manageable. His entire kind of raison d'etre way of being in the world was making sure that especially young, small children people had access to some skills and capacities and knowledge around how to wade into and process some really big feelings. And so I think it's really important to be able to name the feelings that we're having in relationship with grief, because ultimately it's really challenging to process what's happening when we're hit with that overwhelming wall if we're not able to kind of parse through that. And so we want to start with a conversation around managing feelings for that reason, right? Figuring out how to mention these things so that we can manage them. So ultimately we take a trauma-informed and healing-focused approach to grief, and we wanted to talk through a little bit what that means. So we recognize that for lots of folks, the experience of trauma is something that is present in our lives, and in a lot of cases is ongoing, based on the fact that we live within a variety of oppressive systems that tell us that we're being people wrong a lot of the time, and leave us open to and subject to quite a high degree of violence. And so when we approach grief, it's really important, I think, to be informed by that trauma. So what you can see on this slide is an infographic from Karen B.K. Chan, who is a truly fabulous human being, whose work you can find at that web address that you see at the bottom of that graphic, fluidexchange.org. And so this is a graphic for understanding the way in which we might react when we're finding ourselves in circumstances that are pushing us into the panic zone. So we see at the center there, that comfort zone. That's a space where we're feeling really solid, really centered, really in ourselves, not really challenged by what's happening for us, whether that's an experience of loss or grief, whether that's an experience of new learning. We're really solid in that comfort zone. In the stretch zone, that's a space where we're able to access new information. Maybe we're feeling a little bit stretched, which is why it's called the stretch zone, but we're not feeling pushed over the edge into the panic zone. We're still able to engage, and ultimately the stretch zone is this really great space of learning. And that's ultimately where we hope folks can be in spaces like this, where we're expanding our horizons a little bit, but we're not feeling too overwhelmed in that experience. The panic zone is where we end up being triggered or activated based on feeling really out of control, based on having previous experiences of trauma that we've had kind of brought to the fore. And when we're activated in that panic zone, there's several different responses we can have. We can have a flight response where we withdraw or avoid whatever is sending us into panic. We can have a freeze response where we don't really have the ability to like move forward or to do anything at all. Or we might have a fight response, which can result in us fighting with ourselves or fighting with others. And I think it's important to acknowledge that fighting with ourselves component, especially in a conversation, in a context where we're focused on talking about and exploring experiences of disordered eating. Ultimately, like, that's not to shame anyone. Any of those responses are really valid, right? To have a flight response, a freeze response, a fight response, those are all really reasonable responses being sent into that panic zone. And so being aware of where we're at and finding information in those responses can help us figure out how to respond when that's the space that we find ourselves in. I think it's also important to acknowledge that in a time of great stress, like the one we're currently living through, our window of tolerance is a lot smaller than it might be. And so the space between like the stretch zone and the panic zone might get a lot smaller, right? We might have very little space in the middle there where we're able to listen and learn between shutting down and blowing up. And so being generous and gentle with ourselves and others is really important given those circumstances. I think it's also important to acknowledge that our experience of grief is going to be based on our social location. So social location is a way of talking about all of the different identities we hold within ourselves and the way that they impact the way we view ourselves and are viewed by the world, and therefore the way in which we experience the world as a result. And so our experiences of grief are going to be through that lens of our particular social location. For some of us, they might be impacted by all of those elements of who we are simultaneously. For others, some of these elements of our identities might be more to the fore in our experiences of grief, depending on how we are culturally experiencing or taught to respond to grief, based on the rights we do or don't have access to as citizens or folks who are undocumented, based on our socioeconomic status and how we're able to withstand kind of the stress that often is resulting in grief, whether that's a loss that's resulting from death or a loss that's resulting from income. So there's all kinds of different factors when it comes to socioeconomic status that can impact our experience of grief. So those are just some examples of ways in which this is an important thing to consider. It's also, I think, important when we're trying to work through our own grief, because that awareness can prevent us from comparing apples to oranges, right? It's not helpful for us to compare our own experience of grief necessarily to the experiences everyone around us are having, because grief is something that's unique to us as individuals, while it may remain a collective experience. And so processing something differently than maybe your partner or a family member or a friend or the larger community you're a member of doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong or bad, that you're not grieving appropriately. It just means that like your experience is a little bit different. And so we really want to encourage you to not make those comparisons, because ultimately they're not productive in the way in which we're going to be able to manage that grief. What you can see on this slide is a reference to some of the ways in which sometimes social location means that like those around us experience our processing of grief as inappropriate. So you can see some shapes on either side of a wall here. The circles had a really great way through, in that the hole in the wall is the exact shape of them. The rest of the shapes are not having such a great time. And so I think it's important to acknowledge and understand that like there are dominant ways of being and existing within our cultural context that are framed around systems like capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy that mean that some ways of grieving and understanding grief come to the fore in the like broader cultural understanding of what that's going to look like. And so it's important to challenge those dominant configurations or approaches to grief, because they're leaving a lot of things out, and often they're leaving folks behind or out of conversations, and to deal with their grief in ways that like aren't necessarily going to work for us as individuals, because they're not culturally relevant or they're not relevant to the actual experiences that we're having. And so in considering social location in respect to grief, that's a particularly important part of that conversation as well. I think it's it's really interesting to also consider the ways in which experiencing oppression and marginalization can sometimes leave some of us with trauma superpowers. I really am not a huge fan of the concept of resiliency necessarily, because it often is used to like infer that those of us who have had experiences of like trauma based on marginalization and social oppression are like, whew, so resilient because we're like forced to carry these huge loads on our shoulders at all times. I prefer instead this concept of psychological rank from rank theory. Psychological rank indicates that for folks who have had experiences where perhaps you are marginalized based on your gender or your race or your attraction or your relationship with ability, to name a few examples, you're left with a higher level of potential superpowers to bring to bear on future stressful situations. So I love, and I'm sure lots of folks are familiar with this this meme of the dog in the fiery house, just having a nice little coffee and saying this is fine. And I think when you have trauma superpowers based on psychological rank, sometimes you can find yourself in the midst of a fire feeling exactly like this dog, like this is not my first rodeo. I've been here before. I've dealt with lots of grief. So I know how to proceed and what to do. So to give like a personal example, a couple of years ago, my brother's mother unexpectedly passed away. And when that happened, I had just a year before lost my grandmother, who was very close to me. And so I was very much able in that moment to show up for him because I knew what that experience of grief was like. Our other very close friend, however, has never experienced a loss like that before. And so in that moment, he had no idea what to do or how to support our friend properly. And so that's just one example of how like a previous experience can like equip you with those superpowers. I said psychological rank, RANK. And so that's a way of acknowledging that these capacities are things that we gain based on the experiences that we've had that are maybe a little bit difficult or very difficult. And so that's a component of experiencing marginalization or oppression that I think sometimes doesn't get acknowledged, but I think is worth mentioning when we're talking about grief, because ultimately it means that like we might not be unfamiliar with the experience in the way that folks who haven't had those experiences are. So lots of folks are really familiar with the 5 stages of grief as a system of understanding grief. And I think it's important to address the fact that like these 5 stages of grief aren't necessarily something that makes sense for everyone. They come from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and they're so well known within popular culture that often there's this belief or assertion that like grief is always going to look this way for everyone, right? We're going to start in denial, we're going to then move into anger, move into bargaining, then into depression, and end up in acceptance. And the reality is that grief doesn't look the exact same way for everyone, based on the fact that we're all having the same life experience, and based on the fact that like feelings are complicated, and being restricted to just those 5 can mean that we're not really open to understanding some of the other components of the experiences we're having emotionally. Can you go to the next one, Christine? So the initial 5 were listed on that last slide. In work with David Kessler, Kubler-Ross also added shock at the very beginning and meaning making at the very end. So shock, I think, is important as an addition there, certainly, because often the experience of encountering grief is one where we're really unsure what exactly it is we're supposed to do moving forward. Meaning making allows at the very end there some space for like what it looks like to move forward once we've accepted the loss. How have we like taken the information that we've gained from that experience and applied it to our lives in order to move forward and to shift and grow around that grief. Ultimately, even with these 2 additions, we're still really limited, right? And having this like very common thought process or model present within kind of like a pop culture imagination means still that we're left without space to consider kind of the full range of our feelings. And so we want to have a quick conversation about that moving forward. Before I dive into that, if you go to the next one, Christine, I also just want to acknowledge the difference between sadness versus depression. So you can see great infographic here about like what depression looks like. Really important, I think, to keep in mind that like it's okay to be sad in the same way that it's okay to be depressed. But the difference between those two things is whether or not we maybe would benefit from some assistance in processing that experience. So sadness is often something that we can work through without kind of professional assistance, whereas depression sometimes needs some access to some further supports that can't necessarily be provided by just our friends and family. I'm not saying that's never the case. As someone who's definitely managed depression without like professional intervention many a time, but I think making that differentiation is important just so that we can be aware that like there's a difference between those experiences. It's I think important to like be gentle with ourselves regardless of whether we're sad or depressed. In the same way, it's important to be gentle with ourselves regardless of what types of feelings we happen to be experiencing. Which brings us to our next tool here, which is the feelings wheel. This is a tool that I think is very helpful in all kinds of contexts, but certainly when it comes to grief, because again, the feelings and experiences we're having in grief are often really complex and difficult to parse through. And so having this tool can be really helpful, because if we're able to name a particular feeling, we're then able to see some other feelings that might be related to it. And so this is a tool that you can certainly take a screenshot of this slide to have access to. If you Google feelings wheel, it's one of the first things that will come up. And something that I'd strongly recommend if you're experiencing grief is to sit with this and to try and name some of the feelings that you're having in order to give you the opportunity to like have a better picture of what they are. Because again, things can feel really muddled when we're under emotional stress. So Christine, do you mind going to the next slide? So this is just an example of what that process might look like. So if we're feeling anger, there's some other feelings and emotions that might be behind that, which you can see illustrated in this, this wheel here. Another tool that you can use that is a slightly different graphic, oh, before we go to the next slide, sorry Christine, no, it's okay. Another tool that I can recommend that can be really helpful, I think, in moments where it feels really challenging to just like look at a graphic and try and work it out is using index cards. And as you identify feelings, writing them down on individual index cards and then going back and trying using that tool to like talk through what that feeling actually looks like. So if you have like a processing buddy, you can have that conversation verbally. Or since the index card has two sides, you can have your feeling word written on one side, and then you can flip it over and write down some point form details about what that feeling looks like or what it's in relation to. So for example, if you've lost, as I have in the recent past, some mobility, a feeling that I certainly am having is anxiety based on a previous joint injury I've had that's never really healed properly, that it's not going to like go back to a point where I can use my ankle in the way that I'm used to, right? And so on one side of the card, I might write down anxiety, and on the other side, I might write down some worries about like what the consequences of having this different relationship with ability might look like. So I'm worried that I won't be able to go camping. I'm worried that I'll be more reliant on other people to meet my basic needs. I'm worried that whatever it happens to be, right? Those are just some examples. So that's a tool that you can use if just looking at the feelings wheel isn't something that's working for you. Because sometimes, again, if we're like under a lot of stress, doing that mental processing can be really hard, and having a visual representation can be really helpful. So the other thing that digging into our feelings can help us do is to avoid toxic positivity. I think often we're really prone in our particular cultural and social setting to like want to fix things, to want to be able to like move through an experience and like have it be over. And toxic positivity is certainly part of that. Can you go to the next one, Christine? So this is a great cartoon from Sarah Merck that's available via Medium, and I also have a PDF copy of that I can drop into the chat in a few minutes. So this is a great explanation of what toxic positivity is and how it can impact us. Ultimately, it's a way of dismissing emotions that are viewed as less than positive, sometimes ultimately viewed as negative, instead of providing space to like just feel sad or just feel angry or just feel frustrated. And ultimately, it can make folks feel even more isolated than they already do in a grief experience. And so I think it's really important to, the next one, Christine, to not insist that grief has to look very manageable, right? It has to look very like half full, half empty. Grief is a very complex experience. And sometimes you can feel the highest highs and the lowest lows all at once, right? Certainly in the depths of grief, I've had lots of personal experiences where I've been crying the hardest I can cry, and then the next moment laughing as hard as I can laugh. And so making space for kind of that full range of emotionality is really important to actually diving into and parsing through the feelings that we're having in a way that allows us to move forward. So the next one, Christine. So what you can see here, and feel free to take a screenshot if you'd like more time to sit with this chart, because we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we wanted to give you some examples of toxic positivity versus positivity, right? So at the top, you can see the statement, things aren't that bad. That's toxic positivity because you're dismissing the feeling that the person's having, versus positivity, which is inquiring, right? Are you okay? Is there anything that I can do to help? I'm acknowledging that something's happening and I'm not telling you that you're not allowed to have that feeling. So that's kind of the difference between those two concepts, right? Toxicity versus just like being supportive. Any questions about that? Great. Okay, so Christine, is it okay if I throw the ball back over to you?
Okay, great. So like I said, I like to invite folks to share about grief and what that is for folks. So quickly, any words that come to you of what that means for you, to kind of just pool the chat room, or if you'd like to share verbally, you're welcome to, of the words of, let's say, by association, perhaps, that comes to mind. Certainly feeling helpless, loss, and there's different ways of there's different things when it comes to talking about loss, right? Whether it's having lost somebody dear to you in your life, having to anticipate that as well can be a really intense experience of grief. Out of control, hard, absolutely. It could be internal. So for me, for sure, and Sookie has shared examples of losing what you used to be able to do. So the ability to do something, feeling disengaged, missing out, comparison to others, absolutely. Sadness is a huge part, I think, and very commonly felt when it comes to grief. For sure. Exhausted, I'm seeing what I missed earlier. Frustrated, angry. Anything else? Not knowing what to say to a person who is grieving, absolutely. Very lonely. It can definitely be a very isolating experience. Very uncomfortable, for sure. I think all of those things are super valid and actually quite common in terms of talking about grief, like a roller coaster, for sure. There's plenty of analogies out there as well on the internet, and shared also by professionals in therapy spaces as well, in talking about that kind of experience. I know my therapist talks about grief being more of a Ferris wheel that is underwater, that comes above water sometimes and goes back down underwater. And so there's definitely different analogies to be used to think about what grief is and how that it's being experienced. So we'd like to take this moment in bringing those shares into the 7 types of grief and loss to be able to table and talk about right now. And there's all of these different types of grief, and for sure there are other types as well. So just because it's not named, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's just a matter of being able to find that language for yourself to name it. It could be a combination of these experiences of loss as well, and it could be very overwhelming at the same time to be seeing this. So we want to gently introduce these topics to you folks at this time. So we're thinking about non-death loss. There has been some examples shared by Sookie and I already. There's certainly other types as well that doesn't have anything to do with death. There is secondary loss, ambiguous loss, cumulative loss. So what I had mentioned earlier around the loss of like the sense of safety that is not there for me, that is very cumulative, and it could very much be the case for many folks. Non-finite loss, anticipatory grief, which is what I had mentioned, and disenfranchised grief. And that's something that I personally often experience around the idea of not being able to feel like I can grieve. And so you feel like you're another or on the outside of it. Sookie, would you like to add anything to this portion?
Yeah, so I just wanted to flag for folks that I dropped a PDF into the chat. Hopefully everyone has been able to see it. It was just before folks were responding in the chat around experiences of grief. So we want to give folks maybe 2 to 3 minutes to just look through that PDF document to see the definitions of these different types of loss, so that you're able to engage with them on a more personal basis instead of just having to listen to us give you definitions. So we'll give folks maybe 2 to 3 minutes to look through that at this point, and to consider kind of your response to what you see in that document, and whether it relates or doesn't to the experiences that you're having or have had. There's lots of different reasons why grief might be disenfranchised, and we wanted to pull that one out just quickly, given that this is a moment where we're dealing with a lot of non-finite loss and a lot of non-death loss and cumulative loss, and those are types of loss that sometimes don't get acknowledged or understood within a lot of the dominant frameworks. So disenfranchised grief is grief that is disenfranchised because the loss isn't seen as worthy of grief. So like having your birthday canceled, is something that is a loss, but sometimes folks are like, get over it, because it doesn't get recognized as significant enough to experience grief. Maybe the relationship is stigmatized, or mechanism of death is stigmatized if we're talking about death loss, or the person grieving is not recognized as a griever. So you're not recognized as closely connected enough with that experience of loss. Or the way in which someone is grieving is stigmatized. So maybe the way you're grieving is perceived as not grief stricken enough, or too grief stricken, right? You're having too strong a reaction. And so those are some of the reasons why grief might be framed as disenfranchised or experienced as disenfranchised. And if you're interested in reading more about disenfranchised grief, there's a great book called Disenfranchised Grief by Kenneth Doka, which is the origin of that piece of language. You know the next one, Christine? Disenfranchised grief also happens in relationship to losses that often are perceived as positive. So you can see a graphic here that represents a gender transition, for example. When folks are able to have a gender transition, often it is a source of a lot of joy, but it doesn't mean that folks don't still experience some grief for the things that they've lost, right? So as Christine mentioned, we're both non-binary people, and so we've had experience with the process of transitioning. Giving ourselves space to identify as non-binary and recognize ourselves that way is an experience of a loss of privilege, and that's something that requires some grieving, right? As is grieving the person that perhaps you were before. And when we think about the context of disordered eating, recovery is often something that comes along with grief. That grief is often disenfranchised, right? The loss of maybe some behaviors that were helping us cope in the past that we don't want to engage in anymore, or the loss of a framework of understanding weight change as this portal to an excellent life that we then need to disengage from and understand differently through a lens where we're not viewing the world through fat phobia and sizeism, right? So those are some disenfranchised losses that often mean that we're left kind of trying to process really complicated feelings. You know, the next one, Christine. Which brings us to how can we approach grief, right? Loss is an inevitable part of life. So ring theory is a great kind of model for how we can address grief when we encounter it. So what you can see here is several concentric rings with the grieving person in the center and different levels of relationship kind of proceeding outward in the various like levels of those rings, right? And the idea is that comfort goes in and dumping goes out. So for the grieving person, like folks are sending comforting in their direction, right? Based on kind of the progression of those, the closeness of those relationships, and they're able to push or like kind of dissolution or kind of process through and express their feelings kind of outward through that ring. So if you're grieving, expressing your feelings that you're having to the people who are close to you and processing them that way. So that's ring theory as one model. Go to the next one, Christine. I think it's important to take a moment to recognize that like some folks are in this space because they want to be able to support others, and it can be really challenging to figure out what to do when someone you care about is grieving. And so ultimately it's about presence, not remaining silent even when you're not quite sure what to say. These are just 3 examples of potential things to express to people who have experienced a loss. Your sorriness that they've happened that's happened for someone, the fact that you're there for them, and a reminder that there isn't a timeline on grief, right? And that you don't want to rush them. So the important thing I think to remember about grief is that it changes over time, but it never really exactly goes away. Imagining that grief is going to somehow be over or gone is something that can mean that we don't give ourselves the space and time we need to think about the feelings that we're having and the ways in which our lives are being impacted by losses and changes. And so the ball and box model, I think, is really useful and helpful in understanding how that process can look. So what you see represented here is a box that represents your life, a ball that represents grief, and a button that represents pain. And we can see that at the start of our experience of grief, often that ball is really large and taking up quite a lot of space inside of that box. And so the pain button is being pressed quite frequently. It's really often challenging. If you've had a catastrophic loss, for example, like a sudden death of someone that you care about, to find yourself pretty upset most of the time. Over time, as you can see, however, that grief ball gets a little bit smaller, right? And it's not that the grief itself shrinks necessarily, but it's that life grows around it, right? And so we start to move forward to fill kind of the spaces in our life that were taken up by that loss, maybe with other things, new pursuits, new relationships. It doesn't mean that we don't still value the thing that we've lost, whether that's a relationship, whether that's another component of our life, but ultimately that there's like a little bit more space around that ball. And so the button ends up being pressed less and less often. It doesn't mean that when the button does get pressed, the pain is any less intense, right? Because I certainly can acknowledge my grandma was someone who I was very, very close with, who I lost maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, but I still, on a regular basis, have my button pushed, right? When I see a lovely grandma on the TV, for example. So you know, that grief is still present, but the space in my life that it takes up is a lot smaller than it once was. You know, the next one, Christine? So lots of us are carrying around our grief balls with us all of the time. And so it's important to understand that folks are going to be in different places with that experience. And so the size of our ball is going to be a lot different based on where we're at in that process. And so remembering that, I think, can help us be compassionate, not only for ourselves, but for the other folks who we're interacting with. Recognizing that we've all had lots of experiences. You know, the next one, Christine? And so healing isn't a linear process, and we're not necessarily going to be A-okay all of a sudden, right? Or A-okay all of the time. Ultimately, it's about making the space for whatever that experience looks like. So in considering grief, you know, the next one, Christine, it's important to think about it in regards to a past, present, and future kind of format. So in the past, we can consider what we're grieving, what we're still kind of like carrying our grief balls around in relation to? When it comes to the present, how many grief balls are we holding, and like what do those look like? How big are they? How much space are they taking up in our life box? And future, what are we anticipating losing? And I think the future grief component is one that's particularly salient to think about in this moment, given that we're living in a moment of great uncertainty and upheaval, and there's a lot of really unknowns that we're facing. And so thinking about making space to consider the grief that we're anticipating is something that can help us be better prepared for, an uncertain future. And so we want to invite folks, not in the space of the workshop, but as maybe something you can do in reflecting on the time we've spent here together today. Draw yourself a Venn diagram labeled with past, present, and future, and it's up to you how much those different balls overlap for you. So maybe the present and future are really overlapping, maybe they're not. But what we'll ask you to do is to write down in that Venn diagram some of the things in each of those categories, past, present, and future, that you're holding grief around or experiencing grief around or anticipating experiencing grief around, as an exercise to help you get a clearer picture of where you're at when it comes to your current relationship with grief. And once you've done that, you can then turn that page over, make a similar diagram, or do it on the same diagram on the same side of the page, depending on how big your writing is. That's all up to you. And to write down a few of the things that you can do in order to cope with that grief. So, some of those affirmations might be helpful, as to might this graphic, which is on this next slide here. So that's, I think, where we're going to leave it today, given that we're at 3:58. And we won't invite you necessarily to do that activity right now, but that's something that you can do to reflect on the time we spent, as I said. So thank you so much for spending this time with us and for taking a moment to engage with what I think is often a really difficult topic, because grief is, as we've acknowledged several times over this time together, something that's really complicated, and that we don't often have the space or the language or frameworks to really dive into in a way that's going to allow us to process the feelings we're having, and to grow that life box in a way that's feel good and productive for us, which is not to say that we ever need to be productive, because that's really tied up in a capitalist system that we don't necessarily benefit from subscribing to. But it can feel like really, maybe the language I want to use is stuck. We can feel really stuck in our grief when we don't have tools or frameworks to understand what it looks like and to dive into kind of working through it because of those gaps. Is there anything you want to add, Christine?
Yeah, one last thing is that often when I'm thinking about grief, and this is potentially what folks can leave the space with, is that when there is grief, you can recognize that there's also love. Whether it's like love for yourself, love for others, love for the things that you have value for, that you've lost. That is, for myself, is especially a great way to kind of be able to reframe it, or at least be able to just hold that feeling of grief to be able to move forward with all of the things that you're carrying. And yeah, I super appreciate everyone for joining us here today, and for the brief moment that I was able to connect with a couple folks. It definitely is not enough time, certainly, to be able to talk about grief, and it definitely is quite common in other types of grief spaces I've held. So I certainly encourage folks to, if you want the space, email in to request it. I think it would then help us to be able to hold more spaces like this too in the future, whether it's at Sheena's place or elsewhere outside of Sheena's place.